when they crucified my Lord. Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they pierced him in the side? Were you there when they pierced him in the side? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they pierced him in the side? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they laid him in the tomb?
They went to a place which was called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples,
"Sit here while I pray."
and he took with him Peter and James and John, and he began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them,
"My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch."
And going a little farther, he fell on the ground, and he prayed that if it were possible, this hour might pass from him. And he said,
"Abba, Father, all things are possible to thee. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what thou wilt."
And he came and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter,
"Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak."
And again he went away and he prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and he found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time, and he said to them,
"Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour is come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand."
And immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, and when he came, he went up to him at once, and he said, and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him, and they seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave on the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, "
Have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scripture be fulfilled.
And they all forsook him and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him. But the linen cloth fell, and he ran away naked. And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all of the chief priests and the elders and the scribes were assembled. And Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death. But they found none, for many bore false witness against him, and their witness did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying,
"We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands."
And not even then did their testimony agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus,
"Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?"
But he was silent, and he made no answer. And again the high priest asked him,
"Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?"
And Jesus said,
I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, and coming with the clouds of heaven.
And the high priest tore his garments and said,
"Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?"
And they all condemned him as deserving death. And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying, and the guards received him with blows. And as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the maids of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said,
"You were also with the Nazarene, Jesus."
But he denied it, saying,
"I neither know nor understand what you mean."
And he went out into the gateway, and the maid saw him, and began again to say to the bystanders,
"This man is one of them."
But again he denied it. And after a little while again, the bystanders said to Peter,
"Certainly you are one of them, for you are Galilean."
But he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear,
"I do not know this man of whom you speak."
and immediately the cock crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests with the elders and scribes and the whole council held a consultation. And they bound Jesus, and they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him,
"Are you the king of the Jews?"
and he answered him.
You have said so.
And the chief priests accused him of many things. And then Pilate asked him again.
"Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they brought against you."
But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate wondered. Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began asking Pilate to do as he was wont to do for them. And he answered them,
"Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?"
For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them,
"Then what shall I do with this man? Whom do you call the king of the Jews?"
and they cried out again.
"Crucify him."
And Pilate said to them,
"What evil has he done?"
but they shouted all the more.
"Crucify him."
And so Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and plaiting a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to salute him. And they struck his head with a reed, and they spat on him, and they knelt down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak, and they put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they all brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mingled with myrrh, but he didn't take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on the right, one on the left. And those who passed by him derided him, wagging their heads and saying,
"You would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Save yourself and come down from the cross."
And so the chief priests mocked him to one another with scribes, saying, Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying,
Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani,
which means,
my God, why hast thou forsaken me?
And some of the bystanders hearing it said, and one ran, filling a sponge full of vinegar, and put it on a reed and gave him to drink, saying,
Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down.
And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that, he breathed his last, he said,
Truly, this man was the Son.
Down the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem that day, the soldiers tried to clear the narrow street. But the crowd pressed in to see the man condemned to die on Calvary. He was bleeding from a beating. There were stripes upon his back, and he wore a crown of thorns upon his head. And he bore with every step the scorn of those who cried out for his death. Down the Via Dolorosa, called the way of suffering, like a lamb came the Messiah, Christ the King. But he chose to walk that road out of his love for you and me. Down the Via Dolorosa, all the way to Calvary. He was bleeding from a beating. There were stripes upon his back, and he wore a crown of thorns upon his head. and he bore with every step the scorn of those who cried out for his death. Down the Via Dolorosa, called the way of suffering, like a lamb came the Messiah, Christ the King. But he chose to walk that road out of his love for you and me. Down the Via Dolorosa, all the way to Calvary. The blood that would cleanse the souls of all men found its way to the heart of Jerusalem. Down the Via Dolorosa, called the way of suffering, like a lamb came the Messiah, Christ the King. But he chose to walk that road out of his love for you and me. Down the Via Dolorosa, all the way to Calvary. Oh,